Assalamualaikum. Good evening. My name is Shafzan Johari and this is Agenda AWANI. Today we'll be talking about the Human Development Report 2019, which was published a few hours ago. And to give you a bit of context here, what is Human Development Report 2019? This report was published by United Nations Development Programme, and among others, it refers or the report itself actually take into account the Human Development Index component in 2018, which Malaysia is categorized as a very human development, we are put under the category of a very high human development, alongside with other ASEAN advanced economies like Singapore and Brunei Darussalam. And to give you a bit more detailed context of where are we in terms of our national standing compared to our peers in ASEAN, Malaysia, Singapore and Brunei Darussalam, we are categorized in very high HD or very high human development. Thailand, Philippines and Indonesia, high human development, not very high. And Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar and Cambodia, medium human development. So what does this mean? Should we feel complacent? There are other issues such as inequality and climate change, which was raised in the report. And how should we deal with this in tandem with the Prosperity Agenda 2030? So to talk more about this, we have here in the studio Mr. Niloy Banerjee. He's a resident representative of United Nations Development Programme, Malaysia, Singapore and Brunei Darussalam. Hello, apa khabar, Mr. Banerjee? First and foremost, can you elaborate more? I mean, tell us why is this report is so important to us?
Thank you, Shafzan. The issue of inequality has been quite a persistent policy challenge for many decades now. That said, three things frame the publishing of this report. One, in basic inequalities like access to education, reduction of child mortality, as a global population we are doing okay. As a global. There are unfinished businesses there. And the unfinished business is within the global average, there are discrepancies. Some countries are pulling ahead faster on reducing inequalities, particularly with access to basic services. Some countries are not pulling ahead that fast. So what we used to know as developing countries, as a block, there is a split happening within that. There is some pulling away of the higher human development countries like Malaysia, whereas some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, still have a long ways to go. So within inequality, the overall inequality picture, we have unfinished business. The second part of that is there are new inequalities emerging. And this report actually points to two areas where we need to be paying attention, two drivers of inequalities. One is climate change, and the second is technological disruptions, advances, technological transformations, which are likely to create new kinds of inequalities, and therefore the reason this report is very timely is because it's right at this moment in history where we can make a difference before these new inequalities become entrenched in our political and economic order.
It is very, what I call, insightful to actually read about this. When I was studying economics back in school, the way we measure inequality is through the National Poverty Index. And it's very, I would say, number one, it's very tangible. It's easy, you know. You just calculate how much a person or a household earns a month, and you make your calculation. It's very easy. But you are also right that this what you call index gives you another light to how we see poverty, hence inequality, and taking into consideration the climate change issue and the changing in technology. Now, speaking of looking at Malaysia Malaysia context per se, where are we now? The way I introduce the conversation is, should we feel complacent because Singapore is, in terms of economic standing, they are more advanced than us, yet in terms of HDI or Human Development Index, we are at par. Should we look at that from that perspective, or what are the areas of improvement should we work on?
Very good question. Nobody can afford to be complacent, because inequality is not, as you allude, it is not the sum total of wealth and income in a society or in a country. It is now increasingly in the social dimension. Educational inequalities,
Social
health.
dimension, which is very difficult to calculate.
Well, there are proxy indicators which give a reasonable understanding of where we are. They're good approximations.
All right.
There's no room for complacency for the simple reason that if you take the three very high human development countries in the region, which you mentioned, Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei Darussalam, you will see that they are all, a lot of the influence on the rank and the calculation is driven by per capita GNI, gross national income,
Okay.
measured in purchasing power parity terms. Now, that is good, but that masks the fallacy of averages. It masks the fact, for instance, for Malaysia, that the human development performance of men is much higher than the human development performance of women. Now, why is that? On the health indicator, life expectancy, women actually have a higher performance than men. On the educational attainment and average years of education parameter, women actually do better. But then you look at GNI per capita, women are earning way less than Malaysian men. And therefore the overall HDI index for men is higher than women. So here's one area where we cannot be complacent. A second area where we cannot be complacent is what I alluded to earlier. Because of technology and digitization, there's a new inequality emerging, which is the capability inequality. And the capability inequality is a life cycle process. It begins right at birth, and you can quickly fall back in the capability inequality over the period of your life cycle. So it's overall, again, something that we need to be cognizant of, keep our eyes on, and it will not automatically correct itself, not by market forces. Policy has to be deliberately channeled in a way that it makes these adjustments, these rebalances. So it's an interesting time, and it also gives one clear message to these three high human development countries that as they move from what is now middle income, upper middle income status, particularly for Malaysia, to a developed status, the notion of development has to be reframed away from just economic growth and per capita incomes. So that's why our report is kind of themed as beyond income and beyond today. It's also looking at the future and beyond averages.
And looking at the report, I'm also very happy to see there's a new parameters called the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or MPI. This is something that I just learned about this a month or two. So and I'm very happy to see that it is very widely and intensely put in the report. Can you can you maybe talk a bit about, or brief us a bit about the Multidimensional Poverty Index? What are the characteristics, or what are the criteria and our standing? And also, you mentioned about our standing versus Singapore and Brunei Darussalam. What are the similarities and differences between these three nations, since it is put together in the same category of a very high HD?
Well, multidimensional poverty index it builds on the overall human development index paradigm, which is it still looks at health and education as founding blocks, but it also looks at what is called a decent standard of living.
Decent standard housing.
Decent standard.
How do you calculate that? What are
that
the
unpacks
methods?
into a series of parameters. But to illustrate and make it very concrete for you, if 4 adults are living in one room, technically they have shelter. You check that box.
Okay.
They have shelter, but 4 adults living in one confined room is not is a deprivation in the multidimensional index.
Okay.
So the multidimensional index actually adds up a number of these deprivations and creates thresholds.
Okay.
So you can be multidimensionally above a certain threshold, which would say that you are okay, but within after that threshold, there is also a threshold where while you're technically above the threshold, you are at risk of falling behind if there's an unforeseen shock, or if there's a loss of income, or if there's
based on the parameters, you give different meaning or different definitions to different thresholds, and which are the group are the group of people or group of rakyat that we should take a very close look at.
2 or 3 groups of people. First, there are people who are disadvantaged by the lottery of birth. So to give you an example, a child who's a child of 2 parents who are professionals. Let's say the father is a professor and the mother is an engineer. Will from day one of his or her birth have access to a different learning environment, different level of nutrition. That same child will outperform, even by the age of 5 or 6, somebody whose parents are low skill, low wage construction workers. Now, why that matters? As we go into adulthood, as we go into digital economies, this child who has grown up with a bigger vocabulary, bigger reasoning ability, bigger aptitudes, is more likely to succeed with tests. Aptitude testing is likely to have more logical reasoning.
Put the child A in a better position.
Already. So right from almost from the lottery of birth, you are beginning to see, and this reflects our own understanding of inequalities is evolving and becoming more sophisticated. So you're beginning to see that. Second category where we need to pay attention in Malaysia is women. Because a lot of informal economy work, such as caring for the elderly, is falling to women. And in fact, women staying home and caring for the elderly or caring for little children,
it is becoming exclusive to women. And it's worrying.
It is worrying because women's economic opportunities, as reflected in their income, the band of income that they're performing in, is getting quite compromised by that. And then women are not being able to come back into the workforce and join the workforce at a level where
they're supposed to be.
Yes, that's correct.
Based on their skills and experience.
Exactly.
We'll talk more about the Gender Development Index, which also highlighted in the report. And we're going to take our first break, and when we come back, we'll talk more about the Human Development Report 2019 and how would this report helps us helps Malaysia in embarking the Prosperity Shared Vision 2030. Don't go away. Come back right back. welcome back to Agenda AWANI. I'm still with Mr. Niloy Banerjee. He's a resident representative of United Nations Development Programme, Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei Darussalam. And earlier today, we talked about among the parameters of the Human Development Report 2019 is the Gender Development Index, or in short, GDI. So GDI in Malaysia, it shows that women perform male in terms of life expectancy at birth, expected years of schooling, and mean years of schooling. However, male outperforms women by drastically in terms of income. So this is something that Mr. Banerjee said this is something alarming and should be addressed. Now, while government is, pursuing the Prosperity Shared Vision 2030, what would be your recommendations to address the inequality, the gender inequality in Malaysia?
There are, you're right. It's a little concerning that the gender dimension of human development is quite skewed. The male index of human development is much higher than the female index. In fact, if you take the number for the female index of human development, it's no longer very high human development. It falls into the high human development category. It falls one tier.
So this category, gender category, actually the one who would gives us the hard time for us to pursue the high level. All right.
Correct. So Malaysian women are actually one tier of human development lower than Malaysian men. Although the average is above the tier, but still it's something to think about. As I said, gender is a social construct. It's also a power construct. Social norms dictate that women are expected to
stay at home,
if necessary, fall out of the workforce to look after young children or to look after elderly parents. That's causing a disruption in incomes. There is also an issue of glass ceiling and the ability of women to be in power. Malaysia's, for instance, the percentage of women in parliament relative to countries that it compares with in GDP, GNI, is not as high. It should be higher. We should aspire to be higher. So there is a power dynamic too, which is frequently called the glass ceiling. Now the good news is with the digital economy, we have some opportunities. But these opportunities will not happen on their own. It's not auto-generative, it's not market forces driven.
Pushed through policies.
Policies have to be proactively working for it. So a lot of women who are missing out on income by being at home, being a caregiver, could now participate in the digital economy through e-commerce, through gig economy, through even regular consulting stuff that you can sit at home and write a conceptual paper which somebody would use. And mobile phone and algorithm-based technology actually helps connect very quickly.
Enabling this to happen.
Enabling, exactly. If I'm an e-commerce person selling a product, I can connect to customers quite quickly. Similarly, if I'm looking for gig work, say 3 days a week or 5 days a month, I could easily find people who are looking for gig workers who need short-term help in their offices or their businesses. So there is opportunities there. But this has to be incentivized through policy, through tax breaks, through bringing these gig economy workers into, for example, social protection schemes like the Employees Provident Fund scheme. So, policy has to consciously push in this direction. It's not going to happen.
And it requires a lot of work. Let's say if we compare ourselves to countries like Denmark or the Scandinavian countries, Scandinavian economies, where even though about 40% of their tax or 40% of their income goes to the income tax, but their social needs are all taken care of from baby, from cradle to grave. Yeah. should we move toward that, or how do you see other similar economics with similar what I call numbers and index or ranking are moving towards to? Where should we learn from?
I mean, look, globally the evidence is towards universalism, that social policies should be universally applicable.
Okay.
Now, that is the norm that we aspire to. Then that is, of course, mediated by factors like what is your budgetary envelope, what is available to provide cradle-to-grave services, what kind of budgetary envelopes do you need, what kind of future revenue streams you have or can project towards. So what exactly you settle on will depend on these two factors. Where does Malaysia want to benchmark itself?
All right.
And then what is the budgetary situation? What is the fiscal
But it is also the case of prioritizing, right?
It is a prioritizing question. And that's why where political will finally ends up is absolutely critical.
Now we talk about political will, and political will says it's Prosperity Shared Vision 2030. What would be your recommendation based on this report?
Well, first, the report actually almost provides a baseline document to policymakers from which to build on. The good news is that the UNDP and the United Nations system are already working quite closely with the government at the invitation of government to look at the construction of the 12th Malaysia Plan, which is essentially the expression of the shared prosperity vision into a planning and policy instrument.
So what would be your hope for the Malaysia Plan?
I think
12th Malaysia Plan.
I think there are some very promising gold veins already in the shared prosperity vision, particularly the two areas of disruption that I talked about, technological and climate change related. So the shared prosperity vision, for example, talks about moving to a green economy, moving to renewable energy, and moving to high value agriculture.
All right.
Similarly, on technology disruption, the shared prosperity vision talks about preparing for the digital economy and preparing for industrial revolution 4.0.
I think that is why this report is very important, because it gives us, it reflects the future report that the government gonna make. So this report is available on the internet, on UNDP's website.
Correct.
And everyone, if not exclusively if you're not working for the government, or if you're not working for the ministries, private company, if you're working for a private company, or you have your own business, or even if you're a caretaker, a mother, for instance, you would want to get a glimpse of what the report has for you, and then you understand how you can play your role as a member of democracy, Malaysia democracy, to fight for your own future and play a role as a member of democracy in a very stronger and a very, what I call, concerted voice. That's all, I guess, for today. Thank you so much, Mr. Niloy Banerjee, is the resident representative of United Nations Development Programme for Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei Darussalam. We were talking about the launch of, we're talking about the Human Development Report 2019, which was launched a couple of hours ago. We're very proud to have the report here, and we've been studying the report for the last few hours, and we'll study more, and we're going to dissect this and put it in our stories, put it in our news on Astro AWANI, channel 501, as well as www.astroawani.com. Till then, I'm Shabzan Johari. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.